We're in the information age, but facts are in short supply. Reject the noise, ask bold questions, and seek the truth with FBI whistleblower and common sense extremist Steve Friend. This is the American Radicals Podcast.
It is the American Radicals Podcast. It's Wednesday, January 14th, 2026, and welcome to it here on the AmRad Pod, coming to you live on rumble.com/AmRadPod and on YouTube, the American Radicals Podcast. You also check us out over at X America News and at Real Steve Friend, and of course, the audio format available on iTunes, Spotify, and iHeart. So today's Wednesday. What are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about being pot committed and doing a comparison between that and a sunk cost analysis with regard to what's going on all across the news spectrum. And that's going to include yet another investigation into Letitia James, Attorney General from New York. Electric vehicles are costing a lot of money to the manufacturers, particularly at General Motors. Climate pagans are banning anesthesia. And there's a blow to the SSRI industry here with the depression medication. Explosion in single mothers, and the United States Postal Service just lost one of its biggest clients. So a lot to get to today. Glad you're here with us, and let's get after it. Being pot committed. I am not a poker player. I was going to college, though, in the days when everybody was playing Texas Hold'em, so I know a little bit of the lingo. I liked the movie Casino Royale. Rounders was okay, so I know a little bit. I habla just a smidgen. Being pot committed, I believe, is a strategy when you've just thrown in so many chips that strategically it makes sense for you to start calling people's bets, even if you have a weak hand. But in lay terms, I think it means throwing good money after bad. It means that you're not doing a sunk cost analysis. That sounds nerdy, but just go with me on this one. Well, let's say that you have invested in something and you've thrown a lot of money at it in the stock market. You put $10,000 into a particular stock. Well, you look up a couple months later and it's tanking, kind of like Rumble is doing these days. And oh my goodness, it's down 40%. So my $10,000 just became $6,000. Well, do you analyze where it's at now and looking ahead? Or do you say, hey, I've already put $10,000 in and I need to stick with it just to recoup my money? That's a failure to do a sunk cost analysis. Which happened before really isn't relevant to what's happening now. How are the industry shaping up? What are the long-term investments from the company? You have to analyze the battlefield conditions as they are versus what you've already done. Now, from a personal standpoint, the Federal Bureau of Investigation does this very poorly. Now, there's some bureaucratic reasons tied to it and certainly some financial incentives for the individuals connected to the bonus structure they have. But let's talk about a regular domestic terrorist investigation. Now, I had this happen to me. Got moved over to work on a joint terrorism task force focusing on domestic terrorism. And they gave me a couple cases. See, you hear these dog cases that have just been on the books for a couple of years. And I did what I thought all agents should do. Read through the actual case file. Be briefed on the case file. I briefed myself. I read through every single serial in it and found out that in my office in Daytona, we were investigating a group of individuals who said that they were part of the Boogaloo Boys. And that was one of these groups that was supposed to be tied to January 6th and racially motivated violent extremists, white supremacists. Didn't have to look into it very deeply, though, because the total amount of derogatory evidence that had been accrued in the case file that I was looking at these particular individuals who lived in rural Florida was that they liked to meet up together and go shoot guns. And they would post internet videos saying, we're on the Boogaloo Boys, feds, to try to make fun of the federal government. Nothing further. And it had been open for over a year. So I tried to close it out. And I was told, hey, we've already invested a lot into this case. Maybe we can ask for a confidential human source, not from the area, but maybe we can ask another field office like FBI Tampa or FBI Miami to provide one of their really reliable sources. And they can come travel here to Daytona. We can pay them. We can pay for their travel, lodging, and give them a nice financial incentive. And then they can go and try to infiltrate this group and see if they'll sell illegal guns. There was no evidence to support any sort of illegal gun investigation, but we'd already invested so much time and energy and resources, we couldn't just close it out. That's a failure to do a sunk cost analysis. It doesn't matter what you've invested before. It matters what's in the future. In this case, it was just innocent people, but nevertheless, there was no indication at the time or in the future that that group of individuals was going to engage in an unlawful activity that necessitated them being investigated by the federal government. So I closed the case because I wasn't pot committed. It wasn't my money and certainly wasn't emotionally invested in it. Or some people were financially invested because they wanted to have that sweet, sweet government bonus tied to the bonus system, to the quota system that the FBI has. So those are sort of like personal examples, sort of explaining what we want to get today. But I know why you're here. Let's get to some of the news stories of the day. And we can begin with one, Letitia James, who is the Attorney General for the state of New York. And she's in hot water, sort of, again. Headline comes from the New York Times, which was at one point a newspaper. Prosecutors said to pursue new investigation of Letitia James. She ran actually on prosecuting Donald Trump, so there's a little bit of retribution here. According to the story, federal prosecutors are investigating financial transactions involving Letitia James and her longtime hairdresser. The hairdresser, whose name is Ayasata Marsh, was indicted and charged with bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. She committed some sort of identity theft to buy a Land Rover, but there's no connection between that transaction or fraudulent transaction and Letitia James. But just because she happened to have committed a crime and has some sort of friendship or maybe just a professional relationship with Letitia James, now United States attorneys are getting very interested in any sort of connection that they can draw. Prosecutors are interested in talking to this hairdresser about her past financial transactions involving Letitia James, maybe beyond paying her for her hair services. Prosecutors last year opened a civil rights inquiry into Letitia James, which is probably warranted, seeing as how they've gone after the pro-life people in the state of New York, as well as the gun people. They has also opened up a criminal investigation, which centered on her purchase of a home in Norfolk, Virginia, which wound up being some modicum of mortgage fraud. I guess she represented that it was not going to be used as a secondary or a rental property, when in fact that's what exactly it was used for. And the total amount of the fraud was about $18,000, which shouldn't meet the threshold of any federal prosecutor. But it was of national intrigue, of political intrigue, and Letitia James is on the radar of the current executive branch, the current occupant of the White House, who the New York Times believes is mean, orange, and literally Hitler. However, they've gone after her before, and that didn't reap any rewards. They've made the promise to the base, to the mega Doppler MAGA base, that they're going to give you those scalps, and the only thing that they've gotten so far is some sort of criminal probe into John Bolton. But the prosecution or investigation into Letitia James hasn't borne out. One was tossed out because the prosecutor, according to a DC judge or a Virginia judge, one of those, was ineligible to bring those charges. And then when the Department of Justice went to a grand jury, the grand jury didn't issue an indictment. It was a pretty bad slap in the face to the Department of Justice and to the executive branch. And they are just hell-bent on going after this woman who the state of New York elected. Like it or hate it, they're a communist enclave, and they're entitled to elect who they want. It really stinks that Letitia James went after other people, went after pro-lifers, went after the gun lobby, went after Donald Trump himself. But you're not going to be able to get any sort of satisfaction in the venues that you're seeking it. The system just doesn't support it. And I'd contend that this is not just throwing good money after bad. This is a distraction. There's a sunk cost analysis here. There's also an opportunity cost analysis. How many of these prosecutors who are working on Letitia James could be going after other people people that didn't have some sort of $18,000 bank fraud. I don't know, people attached to the coronavirus madness. Why don't we go after those folks? But there's an opportunity cost, there's a sunk cost analysis problem here, and we're throwing good money after bad because it appears that the Trump administration is pot committed for this particular evildoer in their eyes, and I don't think that it's going to go anywhere. All right, we can pivot over now to some environmental stuff, the pagan worshippers of Gaia. So I've got a couple pieces here. The first one comes from the Associated Press, and it relates to electric vehicles and General Motors, which went all in on the investments for electric vehicles. So according to the AP, General Motors will be hit with charges of about $6 billion as sales of electric vehicles sputter after the US cut tax incentives to buy them and also eased auto emission standards. So this is reaping what you've sown because General Motors figured that there would never come a time where Pharaoh who knows not Joseph ascended to power. In this case, they wanted the Pharaoh saying, hey, we're going to give you some sweet, sweet tax breaks, regardless of what your income level is, which is government welfare. It's helping to subsidize electric vehicles for the government to say, hey, you buy this Tesla, regardless of what your earning level is, we're going to give you $7,500 to defer the cost. That's the government picking winners and losers. That's the government taking taxpayer money and giving it to whoever is buying a Tesla. And in most cases, it's somebody who's uber wealthy, and then defraying the cost to them and routing government taxpayers to Tesla or to General Motors or to whatever the manufacturer is. Now, in this case, General Motors figured that, hey, we're going to go all in on this. We're going to commit to this wholly because we know that we're going to actually reap the financial whirlwinds to our benefit. It wasn't because they cared about the environment. They care about their bottom line. And that's evidence here, back to the Associated Press, where they kind of give a little bit of a breakdown of just how leveraged General Motors was. And now they're having to bite down on a $6 billion loss because 5 years ago, General Motors announced that they were going to invest $27 billion into electric and autonomous vehicles over the next 5 years. And they also pledged to increase their investment in charging networks for these electric vehicles, which take hours. And they wanted to invest almost $1 billion, $750 million into that by last year, which was a goal that they did not meet. So is this a sunk cost analysis going on here? Are they just going to eat it, or are they going to continue to throw good money after bad? I don't know. That remains to be seen. Are they figuring that the political whirlwinds will shift one way or another? They got to kind of bet on it. They should just bet on what is the most lucrative and profitable for themselves. That's the duty that they owe to their investors. They are a publicly traded company. And it seems like the trend, at least that I can analyze, is that people kind of like combustion engines. Electric vehicles are kind of cool, I guess, if you're into that space, but they're just cost prohibitive for too many people. And I think GM was counting on that sweet, sweet government cash so much that they're going to wind up having to eat $6 billion in losses. Now, I'm going to bet, though, that they stay on this. They're going to continue to eat these losses. Apparently, last quarter, for the exact same reasons, GM lost about $1.5 billion, and now they're losing $6 billion, so $7.5 billion total. After losing $1.5 billion, they continued to double down and triple down. Well, I think that they look at opportunities that are going to be out there, and they figured that President American Psycho will come into power and return those edicts that were coming down from the government, not just in fuel efficiency standards and in tax breaks, but in government purchases on top of that. The federal government is still committed to going completely electric. In the FBI, they want to get the entire fleet, all the vehicles that are out there with the agents who are driving around and support staff who actually have some of them. Those are supposed to be completely electric, which is ludicrous from an operational standpoint. I lived in a pretty remote location when I was deployed out to the Sioux City Resident Agency. I was having to drive 3,000 miles a month. I couldn't have done that if it didn't have a gasoline-powered F-150. If it had been electric, I would have been sitting around charging it. Now, from what I understand and talking to my moles on the inside, the suggestions are going to be that they're going to give agents who have to drive a lot, which isn't everybody, but it's not an inconsequential amount, they're going to give them 2 vehicles. one that's electric and one that's gasoline powered when they really need to get stuff done. And they're going to be responsible for both of those. They're also in the process of trying to convert the Bearcats, that's the SWAT tank that's on an F 150 frame, the armored vehicle, into electric, which will not only void the warranties on those vehicles, but it'll cost the American taxpayer about $250,000 per. And there's at least one Bearcat in all 56 field offices. So do the math on that. And you're looking, what? That's close to like $15 million in order to have vehicles that no longer have a warranty. Oh, and if they have to actually traverse any sort of distance, an armored vehicle is kind of a heavy thing. It's going to eat up a lot of juice. So we would drive a SWAT caravan, say 4, 5, 6 hours. All the SWAT guys driving the trucks, and the van would go as well that had all of our tech stuff, and then the Bearcat would go, and we get out there 4, 5, 6 hours. Well, now that's going to take weeks. You have a search warrant across the state. You're going to have to plan multiple nights in hotels just so the law enforcement officers who are trying to go and do their job have enough juice to make it there and then come back. So a SWAT deployment will no longer be one night. You're looking at maybe a week or two because nobody's actually looking at good money after bad. Now, we can stay on the actual environmental stuff. And this comes from the New York Times, which is decrying the policy changes of the executive branch because Donald Trump is mean, orange, and literally Hitler. So from the New York Times, at one point, a newspaper, under Trump, U.S. adds fuel to a heating planet. They're just never going to give this thing up, are they? We know that it's not doing anything. How many predictions have failed? Their credibility is mud. Their credibility is probably beneath Dan Bongino, which is saying something. But the New York Times is all in on this narrative, and they're going to continue putting it out there because they're pot committed. They are appealing to their readership, which is probably good for their bottom line. And those people are deluding themselves or worshiping Gaia, their pagan god. So from the New York Times, by pulling the U.S. out of the main international climate treaty and seizing Venezuelan crude oil and using government power to resuscitate the domestic coal industry while choking off clean energy, the Trump administration is not just ignoring the climate, but it's likely making the problem worse. The moves follow one of the hottest years on record, during which scientists say climate change supercharged with raging wildfires in LA and deadly flooding in Texas and a Category 5 hurricane that ravaged the Caribbean. Okay, push pause. So the New York Times, which doesn't care apparently about common sense or the science or any sort of rational thinking that went into this, and doesn't particularly care about their reputation as a newspaper of note. That's why they're formally a newspaper. They want to make the case that 12 months of environmental policy by one president has led to the worst temperature rise on record. I thought climate was long term. Oh, well, I mean, don't hold them accountable to their actual definitions. But the examples that they pulled were the wildfires in Los Angeles, which were not organic. They were started by an individual. And the reason that those wildfires would just sweep on down the mountainside and burn billions of dollars worth of property is because Los Angeles didn't manage its water very well. There's no reservoir to actually catch the rainwater water that they have fall every single year, and it just runs off into the ocean. So they didn't have the water available to fight fires. Well, why didn't they? Because catching that water would impact the environment. So your policies to save Gaia have in effect caused the problem to get worse, which would mean that you should probably assess whether or not those policies need to be changed. But they're pot committed to it. We got to go all in on it. And similarly, they don't do any forest management in California, which is required. You got to do some controlled burns. Otherwise, if some nut job starts a fire, there's a lot of dead wood out there that catches a blaze, and then you can't catch up with it. So that's one. The other one was Texas flooding, which happens all the time. There's records of that. It wasn't unique to 2025. Oh, and the hurricane hit the Caribbean? You mean the hurricane that never made landfall in the United States and the president's supposed to care about America? We didn't actually have a hurricane make landfall in the US in 2025. But apparently, the policy of our current president, because he's mean, orange, and literally Hitler, caused a hurricane to hit the Caribbean. You're insane. They don't care though. They're all in. This is a pretty lucrative business model for them. They can do all the crisis porn that they can to their readership who is really caring about the environment, not their own matters, because no matter what they do, no matter what they drive, no matter what they eat, they're not going to actually impact the environment that much. It sells newspapers and it sells certain policies to people because people also vote according to that. Now, they do reference one particular thing here where it kind of gives away what their agenda is. I mean, they're the old gray lady. They're just reporting the facts. The New York Times is a reputable media source. So from this piece again, the headline, Under Trump, U.S. adds fuel to a heating planet. They take some studies, because they're all about the science, from the Environmental Defense Fund, the EDF, which is according to the New York Times, nonprofit group. They found that some of the biggest regulatory actions being taken by Donald Trump could add 32 billion metric tons of additional climate pollution to the atmosphere by 2055. That's a lot of words that I'm not really sure what it means, because metric tons of climate pollution, what the heck? If you just run the basic numbers, they're saying that the Trump policies are going to add about 12% more pollution a year. But I want to go to the Environmental Defense Fund, nonprofit, just straight down the middle, which I'll put on my investigator hat. Publicly available information. Went to their website. Environmental Defense Fund is ETF.org, building climate leaders with EDF Climate Corps. Now, there's a couple elements here that I think everyone should know about, because if you're taking these studies from these groups, you want to know that they're all about the science. So with one click, I was able to find one of the adjacent pages on EDF.org, and it talks about climate justice, addressing injustices for a better future. Because if you're white, you're the enemy, according to the EDF, because as climate change builds upon historic injustices and inequities, our climate solutions must center justice. Another piece of this EDF website talks about economics, because they're communists. Economics helping people and nature prosper together. And that's where they talk about things like carbon credits. What are carbon credits? Here's an example. Let's say you have a car manufacturer that's out there putting billions of dollars investing in these eco-friendly electric vehicles. They're still emitting pollution and carbon, right? There's a power plant, or there's a manufacturing plant associated with it. And let's say there's a second business. They're a shoe cobbler. Are they emitting? Is it anything? Is there smokestacks coming out of the shoe cobbler? Well, if you had a carbon credit system, which Al Gore tried to establish to make himself billions of dollars, every business would be allotted a certain amount of carbon credits. It's permission slips from daddy government in order to pollute, in order to manufacture your good or service. Well, because the shoe cobbler isn't going to be emitting the same amount as the car manufacturer, we're not going to use those carbon credits. Well, they could sell them on an exchange to the car manufacturers. So the car manufacturers would wind up sending money to a shoe cobbler. It's almost like a redistribution of wealth, if you actually think about it. But the EDF, they're nonprofit, nonpartisan. They're just worried about the climate. One more that I think I got here that is worth going into from EDF.org. They're very interested in climate misinformation. They actually want to partner with social media so that they can reduce climate misinformation, according to them. So things that are inconvenient for their narrative, they want to encourage censorship online. That's who the New York Times is relying on to give you the straight dope, just the facts, because they're all in on the climate schemes that's gone on, and they don't care about their reputation. And it's frankly been pretty lucrative for them as far as selling papers and selling the political messaging that the communist left in this country is all about, under some sort of veil of legitimacy with an organization called the Environmental Defense Fund, which gets some support from your federal government. I'll end with that on this subject. The U.S. Department of Agricultural Natural Resources Conservation Service, an arm of the US Department of Agriculture, partners with EDF still. So maybe that's something that we could correct with the current administration. But you don't want to mess up those liaison opportunities. We've already made inroads with these groups. Do we really want to jeopardize that? After all, we're government workers. We're maybe looking to move on to something else after government service. Or if a president comes in who we don't like, we can just land over there with a six-figure job. It's a pot committed. It's an investment in that relationship. And even under the current administration, the occupants in the US Department of Agriculture are unwilling to do up with it. All right. And this is kind of a healthcare slash environmental merging here. This is a gross Venn diagram that Kamala Harris would be super interested in. So we kind of go over to Inside Climate News for our next stories. We talk about being pot committed, as well as is your pot committed into something. If you are all in and you're unwilling to correct it, if you are if you are completely devoted to Gaia as a pagan, you're willing to sacrifice anything, right? And that's your God. Well, here's a latest and greatest example of that, because medical professionals who are pagans are willing to let their patients endure quite a bit of pain just to save the environment. So, Inside Climate News headline: healthcare providers are dropping a common anesthesia drug that's also a climate super pollutant. I think they made that term up, but let's go into this one. This anesthesia is called desflurane. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. Desflurane. It's a common anesthetic used in hospital operating rooms worldwide. Also, a climate super pollutant. Now, several decades after the drug was first introduced, a growing number of US hospitals have stopped using it. And actually, the European Union has prohibited it. So people can just feel lots of pain because we have to worry about the sun monster. Now, if you actually read through this piece from Inside Climate News, there's a little teeny piece here that says at the end, the anesthetic contributes only a small fraction to total global warming, which is driven by far larger volumes of carbon dioxide and methane emissions. So you exhaling as a human is actually the real problem, and they'll get to that. I mean, I guess you probably won't want to inhale or exhale if you're in such excruciating pain that you go in for a medical procedure to address. Then you could just say, let's make this thing all fade to black. I don't want to deal with it anymore. And then they'd get to what they really want. The climate pagans are truly interested in, and that's population reduction. How many times are we going to see somebody stand up at like a World Economic Forum and talk about how we need to get back to the population that we were at 500-600 years ago when there was less than 1 billion people on the planet? That would require somewhere in the area of 80 to 90% of the people on this planet getting liquidated. That's what they're really interested in. That's why they're so committed to it. They have to see this all the way through. They don't care what the cost is, what the human toll is, what the suffering toll is. You might have to feel some pain. You got to make an omelet. You have to crack a few eggs. Now, eggs, we're getting healthy Rocky style. Yeah, that's a pretty good transition here on the AmRad pod. I am, after all, no longer a hobbyist podcaster. I'm a professional at this here on rumble.com/AmRad pod and YouTube with the American Radicals podcast. If you haven't already, guys, just a reminder, give us a nice thumbs up, follow, subscribe, do all those things, and tell a friend or 12, helping to expand this out, radicalize more people. Let's talk about some SSRIs, which is a depression medication or category of medication, and how they might have taken a reputational hit. And are they willing to give up the game on it, or is it just going to be too darn lucrative? Are they willing to throw some good money after bad? And are we willing to endure it as a society? So from NPR, which is still around, stunningly, after no longer getting American taxpayer money, oh my goodness, I thought that was going to be the end of civilization as we knew it when the Doge said no longer give American taxpayer money to NPR. Well, they're still out there. They're still reporting. And the headline here is, exercise is as effective as medication in treating depression. This is a new study. So scientists evaluated 73 randomized controlled trials that included about 5,000 people with depression, many of whom also tried antidepressant medication. Exercise helps improve neurotransmitter function like serotonin, as well as dopamine and endorphins. So all of those goodies hit you when you're working out, you're running on the treadmill, you're lifting some weight. It actually is those chemicals hit your body and it boosts your mood. It boosts your mood actually better than depression medication. Exercise can also trigger the release of brain growth factors. Depression can decrease what they call neuroplasticity, which makes it really hard for you to adjust to any sort of change in your life, which is why if there's any amendment to your regular routine and you suffer from depression, people just can't even then, they will go into a shell. But instead of popping a pill, maybe you just need to go out for a vigorous hike with your body armor, like George Hill, my buddy, does in sub-zero temperature in New Hampshire. Are we willing to uh, evolve? Are we willing to actually give up this industry? So on the subject of being pot committed, I don't think so. I think we're actually going to see a fair amount of pushback from the pharmaceutical industry. Why? Because they make somewhere in the area of $8 billion a year on SSRIs. And actually, you spend as a taxpayer $540 million a year because Medicaid spends that much on poor people to get SSRIs every single year. There's just too much cash there. Are we really going to pivot? Are we going to reevaluate the way we look at and treat depression matters to something that's free? Or, I mean, as long as you're going to spend the money, if you're a health insurance company, why wouldn't you cover somebody's gym membership for 15, 20, 25 bucks rather than having them buy these antidepressants? That would be a fair assessment, a fair evaluation of it. But I think there's going to be a fair amount of lobbying when it comes to our politicians or anybody like that, or even just advertising out there to make sure that you pop that pill. You don't need to go and do leg day. You should never skip leg day, by the way. Now we can stay on health, and we can also stay at NPR for something else, which is dealing with feminism and babies and being pot committed to the message that women need a man like a fish needs a bicycle. So, from NPR, headline: How IVF has led to a record number of single moms in their 40s. Now, they go to this woman who's pictured here. Her name is Laura. She dreamed of having kids, a family she could call her own, but there was one challenge. She wasn't interested in dating, marriage, or partnering up because she doesn't need a man, right? Fishes don't need bicycles. So neither does Laura. She doesn't need a man in order to make people. So she came up with an idea. And for her 39th birthday, she bought a vial of donor sperm. Today, 44% of women, so coming up on half, 44% of women in America are unpartnered. So not even dating? They finding someone and settling down has become less of a priority when they're in their 20s or even 30s. And when some of them are ready to have kids, they aren't letting singlehood deter them. So they're just going to go get a turkey baster. There are many reasons for this. According to this woman whose name is Rosanna Hertz, she wrote a book called Single by Chance, Mothers by Choice, because Miss Hertz is a feminist. Increasingly, young women are pursuing higher education, focusing on their careers, or fulfilling their personal goals, such as traveling around the world or buying homes, because they've bought in, they are pot committed to a narrative that you can have it all. And this isn't unique to just the fairer sex. This is everybody. This is the narrative we were sold from the time when we were in school, but you must go to college or else you're going to wind up miserable for the rest of your life. So you have to go into $500,000 of debt pursuing not just an undergraduate degree, because everybody's getting that. You're going to have to get a graduate degree so that you can get a job and work 80, 90, 100 hours a week looking at spreadsheets. And those family things, you can put them on the back burner. There will always be time. Now, specifically to the women, time is a little bit more of the essence for them because they do have this biological clock, and because they are all in on it, all in on that. They have to have the career, they have to have the education, they have to travel, which is something else there. They said that was more important than making people was traveling. I'm not banging on wanting to go travel. I'm not banging on wanting to have a career or an education. What I'm saying is you can't have it all. There are opportunity costs. And if you look up at your life and realize, hey, I have seen everything across Europe. I have not just vacation. What do they call it? I've holidayed in Europe. I've gone into the hostels. I've done that whole backpacking thing. And now I'm looking at my spreadsheets and working 60, 70, 80 hours a week so that I can get up to upper middle management here in this company, which if I leave will never miss a beat because they'll just replace me with somebody else or artificial intelligence increasingly. And then you realize that what you have really isn't worth having. Whereas if you had done what you're naturally inclined to do and biblically inclined to do, which is make more people, you would have something that's fulfilling. And now you have a problem because as a female, that biological clock is get the hourglass. There's a few grains of sand left in there, and now you're panicking. Now you're freaking out, and you have prioritized yourself, your own satisfaction, or at least what you were told was going to satisfy you erroneously. But you can't admit defeat. You can't admit I messed up. No, you got to be a girl boss. You can't come out and say, that was the worst mistake I could have possibly made. Really, what I wanted to do in life was be a mom. No, you got to have it all. You got to keep the narrative that you can, in fact, work 70 hours a week and still be a mom in your 40s. And you're going to do it with a turkey baster, and you're going to wind up raising kids without a dad. So you're sacrificing their well being. Because there are exceptions. I know there are single parents that do a good job. And you know what? Screw it. I'm not going to issue the qualifiers. It is suboptimal to raise kids in a single parent household. That includes people who are widows and widowers. That includes people who adopt. It doesn't matter. It is suboptimal statistically. Look at the prison rates. Look at how many dudes are locked up in prison and they didn't have a dad. It's suboptimal, but because you had to prioritize your wants and desires to travel or have some sort of fulfilling career, you sacrificed your kids, which is an un-American principle. We're seeing that increasingly. We saw it really rear its ugly head during the coronavirus lockdowns. That was the first time we openly said we are willing to sacrifice our children for the older generations, whereas every other time before, the older generations would have laid down over broken glass so that the next generation could have thrived. How many people say, I do what I do so that my kids could have a better life? No, it was inverted then. And as a result of these ladies here that NPR is spotlighting and making them girl boss heroes, well, those kids are going to have to be sacrificed. So good luck with that. All right, I think I've got one more that I want to get to quickly here. It involves the Postal Service. Kind of a grab bag, but all sort of in being pot committed area. Now, this was reported initially over at MSN.com, which they're talking about how the post office lost one of their biggest investors or customers, Amazon. They ended their partnership with the Postal Service. They decided to end it, and it's going to wind up costing the U.S. Postal Service, which you subsidize as an American, about just under $10 billion. That's kind of a problem because the U.S. Postal Service is in financial straits, which should be a stunner to the American people, you would think, because they, under the Biden administration, came out with a plan to fix their financial status. It was called Delivering for America. Isn't that punny? So in 2021, the U.S. Postal Service, contending with financial and operational crises, announced its Delivering for America plan to ensure it can be a self-sustaining and high-performing entity. And they already had $160 billion in losses. So how are they going to fix it? By spending money, because by being in debt by 160 billion and spending an extra 40 billion, that was going to somehow put them into the black. And they also wanted to buy lots of electric vehicles and then at the end, just jack up stamp prices. Now, how is this throwing good money after bad? How is this failure to do a sunk cost analysis being pot committed? Can we just do away with the Postal Service? We have robust delivery through a private sector. Nobody uses the Postal Service. This needs to go away. That's it. We're done here. We don't need to talk any further about it. I don't need to justify it. I don't want to hear about the job losses. If you're a good Postal Service person, then you will be able to find the similar levels of work for other agencies that are in the private sector and probably better paying. All right. So we have reached the end of the American Radicals podcast, but I'm not going to leave you without a palate cleanse today. So we were talking about being pot committed. This is the video of a veteran who became pot committed on a Rolex that he purchased about 50 years ago. And then he got some good news. It had accrued in value.
Date mark on the bracelet shows that it was made in the first quarter of 1971. Your watch was made approximately 1971, and you ordered it a couple years later. Collectors love this watch because Paul Newman wore it in a movie called Winning. Your watch is more special. It says Oyster on it. They did that for an extremely short period of time. We refer to that as a Mark II dial. And this particular model, being marked Oyster, is extremely, extremely rare. A watch like this at auction is worth about $400,000. You okay? Don't fall. I'm not done yet because of the condition of it and the fact that we have all this complete documentation here also. Maybe one of the very few in the whole world that still was never worn. Your watch at auction today, $500,000 to $700,000.
Sure did.
It's one of the rarest Paul Newman models, and in this condition, I don't think there's a better one in the world.
He bought that watch for about $370. Congratulations, man. That was a good investment. You don't need to worry about any opportunity costs for that $300. Well done, sir. All right. We've reached the end of the American Radicals podcast, but we'll be back with you tomorrow, Thursday, noontime here on rumble.com/amradpod and on YouTube, the American Radicals podcast. Until then, guys, have a great day.
You've been listening to the American Radicals podcast. Find us on YouTube, Rumble, and X at AmRadPod.